The most effective lesson that I've ever learned about marketing is the importance of recognizability. The human brain is constantly seeking the familiar as confirmation of reality's consistency. It is most excited by the unfamiliar, but most comforted when it's categorized the unknown and made it familiar to itself. A new idea is most easily received when it springs from a familiar voice or a familiar face. And in a situation where we're not sure what to choose, we will almost always use familiarity to form the basis for our decision making. In competitive marketing, a careful balance must be struck between offering something new enough to justify its inclusion into a world which already contains the familiar, and also assure the customer that this thing is up to a recognizable standard of quality. A new intellectual property will almost always resemble a collection of recognizable influences in some way or another. But when a work of art transcends into the cultural lexicon, it becomes itself a recognizable influence on everything else to come. When I was a child, I had no context to compare, for instance, the Pokémon franchise to anything which had come before it. The video game franchise at its core is perhaps most comparable to Shin Megami Tensei in terms of things that already existed, but those games hadn't even seen a US release in any form by the time Pokémon Red and Blue reached our shores. Gamers familiar with JRPG conventions from the likes of Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest may have been better prepared for Pokémon's battle mechanics, but considering how Pokémon is aimed at children and is vastly easier than just about any other RPG that came before it, it's more likely to me that Pokémon served as most of its player base's introduction to the genre, rather than appealing mostly to JRPG fans. Pokémon's success as a video game in the US was mostly predicated on its recognizability as a cartoon and trading card game first. My personal in for the Pokémon franchise came from having already become a fan of Magic the Gathering, the card game, when I was 5 years old, and my younger brother had been too young to read those cards or to understand the game. Both card games were created by Wizards of the Coast, and so for me, I was quickly able to understand Pokémon as a simplified, child-friendly take on Magic the Gathering, which also meant that I could understand it a bit better myself and teach it to my little brother. I think my obsession with the trading card game mostly compelled my engagement with Pokémon as a franchise, but the thing that gave context to the whole existence of Pokémon and made me care about it was the anime series, which was familiar to me because, of course, it was a cartoon. And the Japanese design sensibilities weren't alienating to me either, because I had already been a fan of stuff like Godzilla and Power Rangers, and I had a specific intrigue in Japanese media. As an anime series, Pokémon unfairly got a lot of shit at the time of its release, and while I couldn't in good faith recommend the average anime-seeking adult to go and watch the original show, I can at least say that for me, it's a nostalgia property that completely holds up as watchable. Its perfectly preposterous plotline about a 10-year-old boy leaving home on a globe-trotting adventure to catch and train adorable, dangerous fighting creatures, grounded by tight writing and a constantly funny script with an English dub that, while goofy, holds up a lot better than anything else 4Kids ever put their hands on. I feel like that sentence didn't have a resolution. Kept me glued to the screen for the last 20 years. Granted, I watched the couple of VHS tapes that I had of this show dozens of times, so this stuff is so deeply rooted into my consciousness at this point that I can't imagine what it would be like to see Pokemon from the perspective of someone that didn't grow up with it. I'm lucky that enough people did so and can talk about it that I don't sound totally insane saying that I could still watch original Pokemon today. Pokemon created instant widespread familiarity with itself, such that a large number of franchises arose in its image and continue to arise as the decades press on. It's been interesting to see how these franchises all try to adapt and survive, as their fan bases change and they are tasked with the most difficult question a franchise faces. How do we keep endearing new people to the property without alienating anyone who already liked it before? A franchise keeping life can often often depend on its winning formula. Lupin III has lived for over 50 years, practically telling the same story over and over again because the core tenets of the story are endlessly repeatable. Master Thief and friends attempt to steal something cool from someone shitty while the police inspector is hot on their tail. This can manifest in a lot of different ways, but not so many that the show's hundreds of episodes aren't repetitive. Lupin III stays relevant because the aesthetics, the time period, the technology, and the smaller aspects of the characters' personalities can easily be tweaked without damaging the core of the show's appeal. Similar things can be said of Detective Conan, Doraemon, Shin-Chan, and all of the other hyper-long anime series which create an endlessly repeatable and watchable formula. But nailing the particular chemistry of a TV show cast so perfectly that they can win the hearts of viewers across multiple generations is no small feat. On paper, the premise of Cat's Eye is like a combination of Conan and Lupin, in that it finds a way to make criminal and detective almost equal parts protagonist and almost on the same team since they're unwittingly dating. And that show went on for over 70 episodes on the chemistry of that central premise. But without iconic characters like Conan and Lupin themselves to drive the action, it's not surprising to me at all that the series hasn't been reincarnated more than once when it crossed over with Lupin for a strange special episode just last year. Each of the shows that I just named is also blessed with a demographic advantage. Lupin III will always appeal to adults that like sleazy fun, Detective Conan will always perfectly fill the primetime procedural detective role, and Shin-Chan is like a Japanese The Simpsons in how it has jokes for every member of the nuclear family and keeps itself culturally up to date with the times. In cases like Doraemon, where the franchise is by and large kid-oriented, it is also particular enough that I can imagine parents passing the show down to their kids with nostalgic excitement. Pokémon has gotten old enough that it's starting to enjoy the same status, but has also struggled a lot more than other episodic long-running shows to maintain relevance over the course of its run. I think, in fact, it's kind of hard to imagine that the Pokémon anime would have lasted so long if the other components of the franchise, particularly the video games, hadn't maintained popularity so consistently in the meantime. Pokémon has come raging back into popular consciousness as though it never left in the years since the explosive success of Pokémon Go. And what that success importantly pointed out to the Pokémon company is that the interest in Pokémon has long transcended its supposedly kids-only audience. It only needed to find ways of engaging the older generations which had already been nostalgically familiar with the series from its original fad period. After nearly a decade without merchandise in mainstream department stores or being talked about in popular culture or aired on major TV networks, Pokémon cracked its own glass ceiling and cemented itself eternally into the world culture on the level of Disney characters, Marvel heroes, and the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. But what did all of this mean for the TV anime? Video games have a much easier time adapting to generational shifts without fully interrupting their sense of continuous narrative, because the gameplay forms the core of the experience more so than the details of the story or presentation. It's not uncommon for games to evolve substantially across iterations and to maintain both their original audience and attract newcomers just on the strength of being fun to play. When it comes to TV shows, though, the episodes need to be tremendously independently watchable, or else the story needs to be rebooted to expect an audience to check out the latest iteration without starting the story from the very beginning. Seriously, people will treat you like you're crazy if you tell them that you picked up a narrative-driven series from the midpoint, even though nearly every show is written around gripping an audience at any given channel turn and making its tonal purpose self-evident. Just ask your dad, who's already gotten completely immersed in whatever's playing on the channel he just randomly landed on just now. One Piece is the only show that gets the binge-worthy label and expects its audience to actually go back and watch 30 years of weekly episodes to catch up on whatever the fan base is hype about this season. If you don't understand why Wit Studio is launching another entire adaptation of the story from the beginning, even though the original TV anime is still airing, which I'm fairly certain is completely unprecedented in television, just imagine trying to convince someone who thinks Death Note looks old to watch episodes of One Piece from 1997. Almost every fan of the show is going to tell you to read the manga first and only watch the anime so you can experience it with the music, voice acting, and color. A lot of it looks like fucking shit, and the pacing has been infamously grinding for more than a decade, aside from the 1 in every 50 episodes and the yearly movies when the animation cranks up. Those movies, by the way, are a core component in keeping people like me that haven't caught up to the manga but have enough familiarity with the core cast to enjoy some of their side quests interested in these incredibly long shonen stories, which have been propped up in this way by yearly film releases since the 1980s, when the big three were Dragon Ball, Doraemon, and Urusei Yatsura, if anything. That's a joke, by the way. Please don't fill my comments with big three discourse without at least tagging it as engagement bait, or else it's cringe. Pokémon has over 1,400 episodes across all of its releases, and I think it's pretty obvious that no one is expected to watch all of them for any reason other than having kept up weekly for almost 30 years. Even still, among the 25 different TV anime that each have over 700 episodes, Pokémon stands out as the most structurally unique and complicated of the entire bunch. Many of those shows are family and youth-oriented sitcoms like Sazae-san, Chibi Maruko-chan, Doraemon, or Anpanman, which don't really expect the audience to bring a familiarity with the show into any specific episode. They can all be enjoyed as is. Besides One Piece, the only shows which represent constantly progressing narratives across all of their episodes are Naruto, Dragon Ball, and, until recently, Pokémon. However, comparing any of those to One Piece is deceptive because of how each has stopped and started again, or softly rebooted themselves over the years. Both Dragon Ball and Naruto ended their original stories and rejoined their casts later in life, using the next generations of their families to connect with younger audiences all over again. Boruto in particular changes the whole format of the story to better allow for long-term publication, subtracting the sense of urgency in the overall narrative and creating something easier to onboard at any random point than Naruto had been. Creating a continuous adventure narrative over the course of hundreds of episodes almost doesn't make sense, as the wonderment of discovery will inevitably be undercut as the human imagination is exhausted trying to keep a show's formula while also adding something new episode after episode. A lot of anime adventure serials have covered satisfying ground in as little as 26 episodes, like Cowboy Bebop, Samurai Champloo, and Space Dandy, Gurren Lagann and Trigun, or felt richly explored with 39 episodes, like Nadia, 50 like Eureka 7, or 65 like Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood. Yu Yu Hakusho and Hunter x Hunter feel massive, jumping over the 100 episode count, and The Legend of the Galactic Heroes creates the most epic feeling sci-fi narrative in anime over the course of 110. All of the super long-running shonen adaptations are infamous for adding substantial amounts of filler content to keep themselves airing weekly without catching up to the manga while it's still running, and the Bleach or Naruto adaptations wouldn't rank nearly so high on the episode count leaderboards if you stripped out all the filler, although it's a testament to the enormous success of those shows that they survived in the ratings despite that filler, while turning anime fans against the concept of filler so vocally that it's mostly disappeared from adaptations. In order to avoid burnout with a continuous adventure narrative, most of the super long-running shows that tell traditional adventure stories revolving around some specific toy sale driving gimmick simply reboot their entire story every couple of years. The Saturday morning block that runs live-action tokusatsu classics like Kamen Rider and Super Sentai, as well as the last surviving action magical girl franchise Pretty Cure, has boiled the cycle of yearly rebooting down to a smooth science. Each of these shows restarts every year with a new cast and a new permutation of the core formula, aimed at kids who are the exact same age as the fans of the previous show were when that one started. If one season of one of these shows becomes especially popular, it's possible they may receive an entire second season, and characters from previous seasons will always return in new movies to interact with the current heroes, just as a nod to the lifelong fans and anybody who goes back to watch all of the older shows. But fundamentally, each of these shows applies the same formula for episodic storytelling to a different central cast and using different core aesthetic themes. Nearly all of the shows that successfully adapted Pokémon's format also rebooted themselves every couple of years to avoid burnout. Yu-Gi-Oh! Has been the most successful thanks to its zeroed-in focus on the convoluted card game at the core of its popularity. But the individual stories and characters are so dissimilar that different generations of fans often have little to no awareness of what happens in any season other than the one that they grew up with. Beyblade, Yokai Watch, Bakugan, and Duel Masters have all taken the same tactic and found success through the strength of their tie-in merchandise remaining fun for kids over the last few decades. But Digimon is the only one of these franchises which went back to one of its older stories, even after having rebooted itself several times. Fans of the original Digimon Adventure felt a lot more vocally intense about its emotional 50-episode story, and it even received a more Dragon Ball-like generational sequel after its first ending. But 15 years later, after several reboots which never hit as hard as the original, Digimon Tri rode the nostalgia wave of that show's audience reaching adulthood and returned to the aged-up characters for another adventure. Pokémon didn't quite use any of these tactics, but instead implemented a system of continual soft reboot, which placed the same handful of main characters not only into familiar episodic scenarios over and over ad nauseum, but also essentially repeated the entire structure of the same adventure again and again with each new incarnation, coinciding with the releases of the video game's next generation. Instead of swapping out the show's entire cast and stylistic identity every season, Pokémon would just switch a couple of Ash's travel companions and have him conspicuously dump off all of the Pokémon we just watch him bond with over the last couple hundred episodes. I remember as early as the transition to the Orange Islands, which was an anime original area that let the adventure continue in the interim before Gold and Silver had released, feeling my emotional tether to the story start to sever as I watched Ash ditch almost the entirety of his team, and Brock was swapped out for some boring doofus named Tracy, not very long after Ash's loss at the would-have-been climactic Pokemon League tournament. Brock would return less than a year later for the Johto Journeys, but it's important to realize that Pokemon had been running for over 3 years in the US by this point, and the fad was almost completely over. The third movie was the last one to see a wide release stateside. The card game had long stopped being a news subject, and I was getting bullied in the 3rd and 4th grade for showing up to school in Pokemon merch all the time, when everyone around me was making sure everyone else knew how grown out of it they were. Most of the Pokemon fans that I know who continued to be fans over the next 15 years were pretty much only playing the video games and completely ignoring the anime, the card game, and the merchandise, regarding those aspects of the franchise as still being child-oriented. On the surface, it seems obvious to consider Pokemon as a children's franchise, and when it started in the 90s, it was so novel and new age that it's understandable how most adults viewed it with confusion and derision. However, thanks to the popularity of the concept with children and the cultural saturation of imitative kids media in the decades to come, those very same adults were eventually going to recognize Pokemon enough to get sucked into a simplified game about going outside to catch them in real places, right alongside all of the new adults for whom it was emerging as childhood nostalgia. Pokemon Go is something that my 30-year-old brother and my 58-year-old mother can play together and talk about at the park after dinner, even more than half a decade after that specific game's zeitgeist moment has ended. My mom doesn't watch anime, and so I couldn't have imagined that she'd ever sit down without a little kid there to watch Pokemon. That is, until I saw Pokemon Concierge on Netflix. But I haven't tried to show that to her yet, so let's not get ahead of ourselves. I'm bringing it up to make the point that it's actually very easy to imagine how Pokemon could have been more appealing to adults in all aspects of its franchise. For 15 years, I think the series was carried mostly by the cuteness of Pikachu alone in popular consciousness. No matter how much Pokemon had fallen by the wayside, Pikachu still appeared in mainstream places because it is essentially Nintendo's answer to Hello Kitty or Garfield. Other cute creatures are sometimes capable of creating an impact by way of their franchise connection to characters like Snoopy, Winnie the Pooh, or Mickey Mouse, but if those characters weren't so unstoppably popular, none of their ancillary characters would even stand a chance. Pokemon has worked incredibly hard to try and push other monsters over the years, with Eevee seeing by far the most success, especially among people more familiar with Pokemon conceptually. But it's also put more batters up to plate than any other franchise, with over 1,000 unique monster designs at this point. Loving cute things doesn't stop when you grow up, but it does tend to become more nostalgia dependent. Adults who still collect Winnie the Pooh Beanie Babies probably don't watch the cartoons in their own time, but probably do show those to their children because the stories are wholesome and the characters are timelessly likable. It's an inoffensive thing to have on in the background while you do housework, or to talk over when managing your children. And those properties separate kids' shows that live forever in TV reruns versus stuff that kids find out about on their own when channel surfing while their parents are busy. Pokémon has grown an element of nostalgia, but it's never really had the wholesome qualities that would cause a parent to show it to their children on purpose. Originally, the TV show was mostly a comedy with kind of a really cynical edge to it, which has kept it funny to me over the years, but also mostly went over my head as a kid. There was always this undercurrent that the show was aware of how absurd its premise is, and so balanced its emotional sincerity against a heavy dose of self-mockery. As the series went on and changed lead writers, I think the tone became a lot more bland, embracing itself more self-seriously, but without really changing anything about the story that had made it so strange. For comparison, the anime until recently starred an unaging 10-year-old whose adventures either all have or haven't seemingly happened based on the context of whatever episode you're watching, who travels the entire world with what is either a fairly normal or an unfathomably powerful Pikachu, depending on the context of the episode you're watching. It got to be a mess. When the new series Pokemon Horizons started, the entire first episode establishes the main character's school life before she even takes off on an adventure, seemingly just for the sake of establishing how the logic of the Pokemon universe has more closely come to resemble that of the real world over the decades. Aging anime fans who actually wanted to try and catch up with the Pokemon anime had a lot of reasons to be frustrated with its structure until now. Every series would introduce a new, often very bland new sidekick or two so that someone on the adventure can be less experienced again. However, Ash would also essentially restart his own entire understanding of reality and rebuild from zero again as though the previous series never happened. Fans of the first season who remember dialogue in various places about how a year had passed on Ash's journey learned to forget that that ever happened. The blander tone of the series also meant that there were fewer places to go with the stories, so most of them just amounted to the crew showing up somewhere that has a whole lot of one Pokemon there, and then Team Rocket trying to steal all of those Pokemon and failing. I do not believe that the Pokemon TV series could have survived without the sustained popularity of the video games driving new 7-year-olds to the series every few years, but I also think it could have stayed a lot more relevant by shaking up the format a long time ago. Ash is an iconic adventure character, but his personal development was essentially complete by the end of the original 270 episode run that concluded with the Johto League. I can understand how the creators were afraid to leave behind their well-known characters, but instead they kind of ended up ruining them in the eyes of many viewers and milked them way past their point of relevance. None of Ash's sidekicks ever had the space to make a huge impact on their own, as they found themselves standing in Ash's shadow, and Ash was hard to get emotionally engaged with when you knew he was just going to hard reset in a couple of years. Following the success of Pokemon Go and the Sun and Moon games, the Pokemon anime finally made an interesting, if incomplete, decision in rebooting the whole visual aesthetic and structure of the show, functionally making Ash and Pikachu into new characters and surrounding them mostly with the most popular characters from the games. I personally loved Pokemon Sun and Moon as well as the next series Pokemon Journeys, which shifted the style and structure again and did the best job yet of giving its characters clear arcs over the course of the adventure. But I see these iterations as half measures on the road to arriving where we finally did in 2023, with the retirement of the show's entire original cast at long last. Whether you loved every one of the 1300 episodes of Ash's adventure or not, you have to agree that this probably should have happened a long-ass time ago. Fans of the multiple Pokemon manga have long been confused why none of those sometimes more interesting versions of the main story ever got told instead. Each of the games had its own unique cast and story, and while the characters would all appear in the anime, they usually weren't doing anything resembling the story of the game. Not until Detective Pikachu did one of the countless offshoot game stories get adapted to film, in this case the first ever live-action Pokemon adaptation, which went over surprisingly well considering how insane it sounds as an idea on paper. And yet, even with a popular film releasing in the Pokemon universe completely without Ash Ketchum, though it's worth noting that it still had its very own version of Misty for some reason. And even with the full reboot of the Pokemon film franchise, which for some reason, instead of telling new stories in the Pokemon universe, just retold the first year of Ash and Pikachu's journey and then tossed them right back into a new set of adventures, completely disconnected from the story of the TV series. I feel like that sentence got weird. What I find so weird about all this is that I can almost wrap my head around keeping Ash as the main character just because his relationship to the specific Pikachu we've all known and loved from the beginning is so iconic. But I also think the idea of Pikachu has long transcended any connection to the Ash character by the 2010s. I can also kind of understand asking yourself, why change a winning formula that continues to work? Who's to say that Pokemon could become more successful without Ash, or that it wouldn't crash and burn under another formula? I am to say all of that. I asked who is to say all of that. I am to say all of that. I love Ash, I love Team Rocket, and I loved what I watched of Pokemon Best Wishes, Sun and Moon, and Journeys even as an adult, but that is immaterial to the fact that the possibilities of what could have been done without Ash, now that they are starting to be realized, are even more exciting and obviously appealing to a broader audience than what proved to be the case for any of those shows. Maybe the success of Detective Pikachu was necessary for Pokemon Company to realize the potential of doing more with the Pokemon anime franchise, and at long last they're starting to adapt some of the best techniques for keeping a super long-running franchise relevant to every generation of its audience. Earlier, I compared the Pokemon video games to the Shin Megami Tensei series for their mechanical similarities. However, something Pokemon is just starting to learn from that series is how to satisfy multiple generations of its audience at once. The mainline Megami Tensei games started off squarely aimed at older teens and young adults with a difficulty curve to match its intended audience. Growing the Megami Tensei brand, Atlus created the Persona series, whose teenage cast and somewhat toned down difficulty not only drew in younger gamers, but also made the experience more accessible to casual players of the genre. Devil Children then is the most simplified and accessible version of the core concept, aimed at allowing even kids young enough to get into Pokemon a shot at growing up with an interest in Megami Tensei, which might lead them deeper into the franchise if they investigate the other games as they get older. You could see the effect of this most prominently when Shin Megami Tensei 4 was vastly more talked about than the other three had been, thanks to the huge popularity of the three Persona games that came out in between Megami Tensei 3 and 4. Mobile Suit Gundam used a similar strategy to adapt its story to the Forever format. The original show told a complete war-adventure story inside of 36 episodes and received direct sequels up through the 80s until it was already starting to show the bloat of having revisited the same ideas too many times and burned out its creators' interest. Rather than totally abandon the original story though, Studio Sunrise opted to split the Gundam franchise in half, between the Universal Century series, which expands on the story of the original show every once in a while through short, tightly constructed stories, and the Alternate Universe series, which invents a completely new story, cast, and design sensibility every couple of years, and is usually aimed at younger audiences that have no experience with prior iterations of Gundam. Over time, Sunrise struggled to make what is fundamentally a war serial more accessible to children without completely compromising the identity of the franchise, but eventually they found the answer in the form of Gundam Build Fighters, a children's competition series about building Gundam model kits and having them fight unpiloted. I know for a fact that this pipeline of grooming kids into Gundam fans was intentional because I asked a Bandai producer about it during an Otakon Q&A once and he confirmed it. Pokemon has always done a great job of getting kids obsessed with it, but only recently started figuring out how to engage not only its aging original audience, but also their parents and grandparents who are nostalgic for the cultural phenomenon. After Pokemon Go, the Let's Go, Eevee, and Pikachu games were clearly targeted to anyone that had played Pokemon Red and Blue as a kid, but would not have the time or patience to dedicate to RPGs in adulthood, or would rather be able to involve their partners, their kids, and their friends in the adventure. Detective Pikachu was styled as a mainstream blockbuster, and the actual video games that it draws from are family-friendly procedurals as easy for kids and adults alike to enjoy as the likes of Professor Layton or Phoenix Wright. In 2023, Ash Ketchum was finally retired as the main character of Pokemon, and a new main series, Pokemon Horizon, aired its first first 33 episodes, which I've reacted to episodically on the We Watch Anime podcast with my partner Bird. Both of us have been surprised and impressed with the series, which uses its more carefully constructed story and large fleshed out cast of characters to create a more traditional and sincere adventure series with even more to say about interpersonal relationships and child rearing than the original Digimon Adventure did. It feels like a show written by people that love and understand Pokémon and wanted to write a story full of heart, which isn't trying to inject that heart into the shambling corpse of what originally was a fun but far less emotionally or culturally enlightened story. Narratively, Pokémon always suffered this core contradiction of insisting that the point was to catch every single Pokémon, but also that being a good trainer means having a close personal relationship to your Pokémon. Ash Ketchum always displayed a love for Pokémon, but really only ever had a powerful relationship with Pikachu, and even took over a year to get his Charizard to like him, and have usually ended up leaving his Pokémon with communities that needed them more than he did. All of this gave mixed messages that audiences have always made fun of, but if you talked to anyone about Pokémon, it's obvious that in real life, almost no one cares about catching all of the Pokémon, and usually has a special relationship with whichever percentage of the Pokémon population they've either played with in the games or just think are cool based on their concept and design. When I was growing up, my favorite Pokémon was unquestionably Charmander, simply because I slept with a Charmander plushie nearly as big as I was every night, even though I'd played through the entire game with a Venusaur. In my teens, my favorite was Munchlax for years just because of that one scene in Destiny Deoxys where he jumps up really high. Pokemon Horizon's ensemble cast all have meaningful relationships to their Pokemon, which are treated like characters on the same level as the humans, and rarely even kept inside of Pokeballs. There are 3 young people at the core of the show's cast, with Liko qualifying as the real main character thanks to standing at the center of the story, but the appeal of the show is in how much it balances its diverse cast and examines their relationships. Initially, Liko is directionless and unsure about her purpose in life, but decides to travel with people that she admires and believes will influence her to make good moral decisions. Those people, the crew of the Rising Volteckers, include adults of all ages and all walks of life, who come together in the name of freedom and exploration. Each has their own skills and shortcomings, and all of them feel necessary toward the success and growth of their community. Roy, the energetic boy that loves to sing, brings that fiery brashness that Ash was known for, but without the bratty personality. Dot, the androgynous Hikikomori, is a genius with technology and secretly a popular Trainer Tips live streamer of whom Liko is a diehard fan, slowly being drawn from her shell by the new young people aboard the ship that she's lived on for a while and their Pokemon. Liko slowly finds a sense of meaning in taking care of Pokemon, learning about relationships and feelings through the ones that she has with her Sprigatito, and later with the other young Pokemon that she's eventually carrying around like a single mom. One of these, a turtle that sprung from a pendant which Liko's grandma had left her with, is connected to a legendary trainer from long ago, and the target of a shady organization which keeps trying to steal the pendant and getting into Pokemon duels with the heroes, especially Freed's Charizard, whose awesome power ends up inspiring Roy's Hogator to get stronger. Roy, though, is inspired at the sight of the legendary Black Rayquaza, which the gang finds themselves globe-trotting in search of after a few episodes of setup. Episodic storylines take us all over the Pokemon world, somewhat following the formula established by Pokemon Journeys, but with episodes usually based around exploring one or more of the main cast and their personalities, their histories, and their conflicts. By episode 26, a surprising amount of lore and setup has occurred before the introduction of one of the coolest old lady characters that anime has seen in a while. I'm not going so far as to say that Pokemon is not still a kids show. Bird and I watched the episodes sped up usually so that they don't feel as slow, and we both have ADHD. But I am saying that we have been enjoying this show, and we don't have any children to justify that we're watching it when we tell that to other people. Having said that, if I did have a kid that was old enough and interested in Pokemon, I would be infinitely more likely to introduce them to Pokemon Horizons than to any of the prior seasons, and I can't imagine finding it difficult to rewatch. But the existence of Pokemon Horizons, as much as I like it, isn't nearly as exciting to me as the fact that it's not the only Pokemon anime that's being made anymore. anymore. For 20 years, the closest thing we got to side stories were the mini-movies about Ash's Pokémon having adventures without him that ran before the feature films. OVAs, specials, and shorts released through games which mostly still tied into the main story, and short special series adapting stories and scenes from the video games. Over the last few years though, short Pokémon specials with no connection to the main storyline have become ever more frequent and esoteric. There's one cute short that's just about how cool it is to use a slugma for central heating in your house, with absolutely gorgeous animation and a wholesome, homey atmosphere. The recent 4-episode Paldean Winds series from Wit Studio feels more like a tech demo than any kind of story, but shows off some of the slickest Pokemon animation ever poured from pen. Pokemon Path to the Peak, which I didn't even know existed until just now as I was writing this, is a short series about the trading card game with a totally unique art style. Cube-shaped Pokemon on Cubey Island is basically just the Minecraft aesthetic applied to Pikachu, Jigglypuff, and Psyduck. Hisui in Snow is a 3-episode story with gorgeous action animation, which I'm also just now finding out about, and all of these came out in the last year and a half, by the way. Easily my favorite of all these new experimental Pokemon shows, and probably one of my favorite pieces of Pokemon media to date, is the 4-episode, maybe 45 minutes long, Pokemon Concierge special on Netflix. I'm an absolute sucker for handmade felt aesthetics and stop-motion animation, and considering the popularity of Pokemon craft books, I'm honestly shocked it took so long for something like this to happen. More importantly though, this is also the first iteration of Pokemon almost explicitly aimed at middle-aged women. The main character is an overworked office lady who gets a new job as a concierge on a resort island and immediately discovers the bright side of life, doing what feels more like vacation than work. This is unmistakable Iyashike and has the personality of a Japanese live-action series about a career woman more so than it does any particular anime. Its more emotional storylines in the 2nd and 4th episodes are functionally metaphors for raising shy and autistic children. Psyduck's headaches are, more explicitly than ever, framed as a metaphor for overstimulation, which it learns to manage better through expressing its powers more regularly. And the last episode is about a shy Pikachu whose trainer wants it to be louder and smile more, and has a resolution so heartwarming it unironically made me weep with joy. When I watched Pokemon as a kid, it had an overwhelming sense of being made for me. I was already into Japanese shows, cartoons, and trading cards, and it came on right before I went to school. It requires you to remember 150 names in a specific order to be cool, which, I could do. And unlike all of the kids who just dipped their toes in as a fad, I was a real obsessive fan, ready to keep up with the franchise for the rest of my life. But after 4 years with it, I became disappointed with how it didn't seem to age along with me. Ruby and Sapphire seemed to me less complex than Gold and Silver at the time. Pokemon Advance felt like a milquetoast retread of the show that I had already been a fan of. The cards kept getting stronger, simpler, and featuring bigger text, and it didn't feel like Pokemon was too concerned about keeping its aging audience. I played a few of the games because I wanted to see Pokemon with better graphics and new mechanics, but I never had the feeling that Pokemon media was trying to reach me as much as I was trying to cling to the property for which I have this fond nostalgia. Pokemon Concierge, however, felt exactly as made for me as the original series had at the time. I'm 32, overtasked, and dreaming of an island full of cute creatures that I can relax on as I huddle up in the North American winter cold. Haru is exactly as easy to relate and project onto now as Ash Ketchum had been when I was 8 years old in 1999. I can imagine children connecting to and feeling for the Pokemon characters in this show, but the focus is so much more squarely on the adult woman and her experience at the spa that it's hard to imagine much of it meaning nearly as much to a child as it does to me. I mean, for fuck's sake, there's like a minute-long scene of Homegirl just getting a massage. It's not a kids show that parents can put up with so much as a mom show that the kids could stand to watch. I don't think the kid is going to be the one bawling their eyes out at the end of the Shy Pikachu story, though. So, are you keeping up with Pokemon? Or are you curious to check out any of these new shows which maybe you never heard of? Do you think Pokemon can appeal to an older audience without forsaking its core identity? Is Pokemon Horizons as good as I think it is, or am I just high? I wrote way more than I intended to in this post, but it's only because I've been thinking about Pokemon for so goddamn long. Thanks again for watching, and always remember, anime forever.